Good afternoon. Let's get started. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me make a couple of announcements. How many of you are coming here for the first time for this symposium series? Great, welcome. This series runs every week through the semester on Thursdays. Today it's a change, it's an exception, but typically it's 5:15 to 6:15 in the Metzys Hall near the tower every Thursday of the semester. So we'll have the same thing in fall semester as well. This is our last talk for this semester. A couple of things to keep in mind. Please be sure to trash your plates and recycle cans and bottles. Otherwise, we'll have to get it clean, so please leave the room as clean as you received it. Also, during Q&A, one of my TAs will pass around this mic. We are recording this event, so please wait for the mic before you ask your question. This lecture is actually a special. Within the UT Energy Symposium, this is actually a very special lecture. This is in the third in the Energy with the CEO series. We have one of these once every semester. The previous two CEOs were David Crane, President and CEO of NRG Energy, and Doyle Benaby, President and CEO of CPS Energy, which is the utility in San Antonio. It's a tremendous pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Randy Foutch. Randy is the Chairman and CEO of Laredo Petroleum. He has over 30 years of experience in the oil and gas industry. No, Randy, more than that? Happy with 30. He really is a serial entrepreneur, an innovator, and a visionary business leader. So he founded Laredo Petroleum, but before that, he founded Latigo Petroleum, and before that, he founded Lariat Petroleum, and all of these companies were very successful and were sold, and Randy will tell us how much he sold them for. Randy is a member of the National Petroleum Council, member of the American Natural Gas Alliance, and also a member of the Advisory Council of the Energy Institute at the University of Texas here. So we continue to benefit a lot from his advice here as to how we think about research and teaching in energy issues at the university here. Thank you so much, Randy, for your continued support. He serves on several nonprofit and private industry boards. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Geology from the University of Texas, Austin. And I asked Randy before our talk, his bio said University of Texas, and I just wanted to make sure it was from Austin. And he said when he went to school, there was only one University of Texas. So welcome back, Randy.
Thank you.
Go Longhorns. He also has a Master's of Science in Petroleum Engineering from the University of Houston. And he's going to share with us his own experience as an innovator, as an entrepreneur within the context of the Energy Institute. Please join me in welcoming Randy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to talk about kind of three broad subjects today, and we can go into this as much as you want. If there's not a lot of questions at the end of the prepared talk, I'm going to do the talk again, so I suggest you have questions, and let's make this as interactive as we can. The first thing I want to talk about a little bit is kind of I went back through and looked at some of your other speak. I want to talk a little bit about what I think the oil and gas, natural gas business is today, and I'm going to suggest to you very much that it is now a sustainable energy source. It is as sustainable as anything we have. We'll talk about that in a second. I want to talk a little bit about, I was asked to talk a little bit about private equity and how I funded my companies, so we'll talk about that. And then the third thing is I'll talk a little bit about Laredo and where we are and how we got to where we're going. So those are the three things that I hope I generate some questions and excitement and some interaction with you. And I do want to thank you for giving me your time. I do have an affinity for the University of Texas going way back. We're a public company, so we have to disclose this. Forward-looking statement. What this effectively says, I don't think anybody reads them. What it says is, you can't hold anything I say against me. Anything I say may not be true. Use your own discretion and judgment when you look through this. But in our view, there's been three really, really significant step change in the oil and gas exploration business, the upstream exploration and production business. Going back, if you're from Texas, there's a Copano publishers, they suggest that Colonel Drake was not the first one in Pennsylvania to find oil. They go back 30 years before Colonel Drake did in Pennsylvania and found records where people were actually drilling very, very shallow wells for oil in Texas. So the first thing that made the significant change was the rotary bit, the ability to drill, cut cuttings, and push them out of the hole. Dramatically changed, step changed the business. Instead of making a few tens of feet a day, you could make thousands of feet a day of hole. The second thing that I think changed was the ability to drill offshore. Huge amounts of oil and gas discovered offshore. Tremendous step change. Very, very technical business. Lots and lots of engineering. Lots of things that are used everywhere else came out of our ability to drill offshore. Dramatically changed the business worldwide. The third thing is, and this is very, very recent, is our ability to drill long-reach horizontal wells and fracture stimulate them. I think it's going to wind up having more of an effect on the business than either the rotary bit or our ability to drill offshore. We'll talk about that in a second. Interesting to me, and I think there's a lot of, Rick and I met this morning and on a subject with some other people, and there's all the debate about hydraulic fracturing and what it is. Most people who complain about it don't understand it. The fresh water that we're trying to all protect, the potable water, is within a few hundred feet of the surface. We're fracking wells that are 8,000 or 10,000 feet deep, and long reach horizontals. It's protected by cement, protected by pipe. This has really been revolutionized the oil and gas industry. We knew these zones had oil and gas for years. We would drill through them conventionally, and they would give us problems. They'd produce enough oil and gas during the drilling stage that they messed up our mud systems, but we never could complete them. This is all relatively new, 5 or 6 years, maybe 8 or 9. Mitchell Energy, George Mitchell, has a book out that where he talks about how he developed the Barnett play. It took him 30 or 40 years to get there. It's an interesting book, but he really didn't figure out the secret until certainly within the last decade or so. It's allowed us worldwide to produce hydrocarbons in quantities and supplies that we've never had possible. We've taken it from a position to where we were running out to an argument that is now very, very sustainable. As sustainable as any other energy source, certainly for 100 plus years. This is an example of this. This is the amount of natural gas that's come only from shale gas. This doesn't have our conventional supply in it. And you can see that if you look at that lower left-hand corner, since 2005, 7 or 8 years ago, the amount has been increasing by about 50% per year. That's a huge increase in supply of natural gas. You've had the lectures, you know this. We have enough natural gas to last us 150, 200 years at current rate, and we're finding more every day. We're doing it pretty efficiently. We're doing it very, very cost effectively. That's a new phenomenon. Shale oil. We used to think that we couldn't produce molecules that were bigger than the pore throat of the porosity. Technically, that's a little bit of an issue, but now we know we can do that. The same techniques we use for natural gas apply to crude oil. And the rate of growth on crude oil is expanding faster today than the rate of growth on natural gas was. We have tremendous, tremendous supply coming on. Very, very sustainable. We're getting this. This is just the U.S. map. But Canada has a number of basins that we're producing significant amount of crude oil from. Mexico has some that are likely, that could be, probably are. Technically, they're behind us. This is something the United States is in the lead in. We now know that the Monterey Shale in California, there's lots of political issues with California, regulatory issues, but the Monterey Shale in California is as big as anything we have. We now know, that the Permian Basin, where we are active, is as big as the Bakken or the Eagle Ford or some of these other things that we've been producing for 5 or 6 years. So not only is it sustainable, we can duplicate it, it's cheap, it's effective, it will influence the price of crude oil ultimately, but it is all over the United States. I mean, some places aren't going to have it, but the oil and gas conventionally used to be out of the 50 states really a 10 or 12, 14 state issue. Politically, most states didn't really care about it as long as their burners turned on and as long as their cars drove. Now we're seeing that we have significant crude oil, significant natural gas coming out of from some of these states before that were just minor participants in oil and gas. Very, very meaningful. Six or 7 years ago, 8 years ago, if I had stood here and said, we really have a chance in North America to talk about energy security and energy independence, most people would have just laughed at me. They would have considered me to be a flake out on the deep end. I don't think that's the case now. I think we can actually have a conversation about what this sustainable hydrocarbon energy base means to us. We are, in many, many ways, blessed with a really cheap energy source for years to come. We are, in many ways, the leader in how to protect the environment by drilling, producing, refining hydrocarbons. We certainly have many, many more rules and regulations than anybody else in the world. North America, not just the United States. Canada is right in there with us. So there's an argument that we ought to be climate change, producing natural gas, using it, climate change, environmental, we ought to be doing it here as opposed to elsewhere. The interesting thing to me, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, is that if the current trends, the current rate of growth continues, we actually have the ability to make OPEC of no matter, totally irrelevant to what we do. Now that's a pretty powerful statement, I think, and it has some interesting political ramifications. I think if you look at most countries in OPEC, a failure to have significant revenue from oil and gas could be a pretty big destabilizing influence. That's their revenue. I'm not sure that we're not better off without an OPEC, but I do think we need to be very, very aware of the consequences of more destabilization in that area. But we can have this conversation now. We couldn't. That's the takeaway on my first point, is we do have natural gas, we do have crude oil, it is sustainable, we can do it here, we know what we're doing. In the United States, we've fracked over 1 million, actually over 1.2 million wells. There's been no documented cases of environmental. Even our Department of Energy says that. There has to have been some somewhere, but it's not an environmental disaster in any means. We do have some issues we've got to figure out, but we can actually have a conversation about sustainable oil, sustainable natural gas, and we are changing the world's view of energy. It's kind of interesting to me to see Russia, up until this year, viewed all of this hydraulic fracking, long-reach horizontals. They just disbelieved it, said it didn't happen. Couldn't believe it. There's been just enough drilling in Poland now where Gazprom has the pipeline coming through that delivers gas, natural gas, to Eastern Europe, where they know that Europe is going to have lots of abundant natural gas. Before, the only real source was Russia. Now they can do it in country. It's had a huge impact on the politics of Russia and some of the other former Soviet Union states and Eastern Europe. Huge impact worldwide. This is for real. It's going to happen. Change subject slightly. Let's talk about the companies we've had. We call them L companies, although one of them started with a C, the others started with L's. We moved to Tulsa and we fixed a company that was broken. Didn't intend to stay there and fell in love with Tulsa. Came back and put together Colt Resources. It was turning deals, finding oil and gas. Built it up to where it had some size, brought in some private equity. I'll talk about private equity. Got to the point where we were going to have to make some decisions about going forward, and chose to sell it. It was sought after because it had more opportunities than many other oil and gas companies had. We had captured opportunities. Went and did Lariat. Lariat we took almost to the point of going public. We were ready to go public, chose not to. Concurrent with the process, we invited 5 companies in to see if we could sell it. Again, Lariat had more opportunities in front of us. This will be important in just a second. Than most other companies, so we were highly sought after. We sold it. We went and did Laredo. Again, we had it kind of run to public company standards such that we could have gone public if we wanted to. We had private equity, again, Warburg and J.P. Morgan. At Lariat, we just had Warburg. Talk about that again in just a second. We got it built up until we were drilling out of cash flow, had plenty of opportunities to keep the company. Again, we had more opportunities in front of us, more places to invest capital than most other companies. That's a pretty valuable commodity. So we put the company in place, sold it. All of our employees at all these companies had ownership. They cashed out, so they were pleased with the process. We put together Laredo. Laredo, again, we ran it to public company standards. We thought that if we were lucky, we would create more opportunity than our competitors, and again, be a very valuable company. But what we did at Laredo is interesting. We had, at Colt, we had 2 or 3 years drilling. At Lariat, we had 2 or 3 drillings in front of us we could see. At Laredo, we had 2 or 3 years drilling in front of us. At Laredo, we probably have 20 plus years of drilling in front of us. It's a resource play company. We're using long horizontals, and we're fracture stimulating. That's significantly different than my prior companies, but it's also a sign of the times. When you have a sustainable hydrocarbon source in the United States, there's going to be a lot of companies that have many, many years of drilling in front of them. Laredo is probably in the magnitude of needing $20+ billion investment in it over the next 10 or 15 years. Huge potential not only to invest economic capital, but to produce oil and gas and the sustainable hydrocarbons. All of the companies were in the same area, the Anadarko Basin, the Permian, Arcoma, places like that. We chose those specifically. We didn't want to be in places where the permitting process was confused. We wanted to be in places where the states regulated it. We knew what the rules were. They knew what the rules were. They're educated. We wanted to be in places where the mineral ownership was clear. We wanted to be in places where we didn't have to mess with the federal government. We just wanted a clear path on how you get things done. Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and other states where we've got a 100-year history of drilling, they provide that clear path. And it's worked very, very, very well.
Randy?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us the background for the L?
The
companies, and why did you choose the Laredo, Laredo?
Yeah.
Laredo?
The question was, can I tell you why L, and what's the background between using L in the 3 companies? And I wish I had a good answer. The simple answer is that this was when I started. The first L company was kind of in the .com day, and I didn't want to have anything that had a .com connotation. At the time, I was team roping, rodeoing pretty heavily. We spent a lot of time working on the business plan for the company. I'll talk about that just. We spent a lot of time making sure that we had the right board matrix. We spent a lot of time thinking about the company. I didn't give the name 5 minutes thought. None. I was almost ambivalent about the name. It came time to incorporate. It seemed like a good name. Lariat, of course, is Spanish for rope. A lot of my family was involved with me in the rodeo, and so we picked Lariat. No reason that I know of. Lariat was successful. I'm not particularly superstitious, but I didn't want to go start something with an M. So we looked around and we found a name that wasn't registered that we could use, and Laredo came up. We chose it. Again, no thought. About 6 months after we were in business and we had gotten some things moving and we were happy, I actually went to and looked up Laredo on the web. And it does mean rope or small whip or something like that in Spanish, small rope. But if you go look up Laredo, you'll get a whole bunch of hits on stores in California that sell leather undergarments and things like that. Not what I wanted my company to be part of. It was successful. So then I was committed to the L's. I had no choice. So we looked around and we found an L-sounding Western kind of a sounding deal that wasn't whips and leather underwear in California, and came up with Laredo. I got to get a better story for that. All of the companies, and this is something we talk about almost every quarter internally, really feel like it's important to talk about the culture of what you're doing. What is your road that you're going to follow? What is the basis that you make decisions on? What are the bases on how you really look at the company? And we talk about this a lot, and I talk about it maybe not often enough, but I do talk about it more than most CEOs do because I think it's important to me personally. Always doing the right thing sounds so simple, but sometimes you don't know what the right thing is. You have incomplete data. You don't know where the future holds. But if you start off your decision-making process thinking about, I want to make sure I do the right thing, you'll get it right a lot of the time. None of us are perfect at that, but that's core to all of these companies going way back. Stewardship, I fault the industry a little bit for this. I don't think the industry does a particularly good job of talking about its stewardship. I think we do a pretty good job taking care of people. It's a highly educated, highly motivated, highly paid industry. I think in general we do a pretty good job talking about the environment, but I don't think our stewardship as an industry is good. So for us, it's important that we do that we represent the industry publicly, and that we walk the walk in terms of doing the right thing. Respect, that's pretty simple to me. I want to make sure that everybody gets treated the way they want to get treated. We talk about that a lot. This is a big deal in my companies. Teamwork, it's one company. Everybody has some ownership. If you do your job, but you're not helping him do his, and they have problems, we've destroyed the potential to create a lot of value. So we really talk about making sure everybody understands that if you're in accounting, you need to be aware of and help everybody else. If you're an engineer, you need to make sure that accounting gets from you what they need. This is a big deal. We don't want to have separate subcultures everywhere else throughout the company. We have 3 offices with pretty big representation in each office, and we spend a lot of time making sure that everybody talks about it as if it's one company. We want to be successful. We're not in this for practice. It's amazing to me how often people don't understand that we're in this to be successful. We're in this to do something, to create something. So we talk about this a lot, and I think more companies should talk about it. As you go forward with your career, you need to really think about how you define what you do and why you're going to do what you do. It's plan for success from day one. This gets misunderstood a lot. Some people view that as going out and leasing the most luxurious, fancy office space they can because they want to be successful and they want to be viewed as successful. That's not what this means. What this means is think through, if you have a project, where it can take you. Think through, if it's successful, where your company is going to be in 2 or 3 years. Don't go find something that's tremendously successful and then not have any ability to take care of it. I think this is very, very important. You see it time after time after time. Companies get started, get rolling, get going well, and then they falter. They falter. The rate of growth slows or stops. And a lot of times, you can look back, and they were kind of surprised at their success. It was like, oh, sometimes good things really do happen. And so in our view, you really need to plan for success from day one. Now, again, that doesn't mean go spend money as if you're going to make a lot of it. Wait till you have the money to spend it in the company. But think about what happens if you're successful. If you really do go out there and you sell 10 million gadgets, think about what that means to the company and how you get there. If you go out there and find a big field, think about what that means and how you get there. We talk about that a lot. Determine your strengths. If you want to have repeatable success, you're not going to rely on luck, although luck is very important. You're going to figure out what you do well. You're going to try and mitigate what you don't do well, but you're going to try and emphasize what you do well. What are your strengths? What do you do well? And I think this is something that's a little bit respective. You need to think about internally. What do I bring to the party? What are my strengths? How do we get there? I mean, this isn't, I'm not going to sit around in a campfire and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but I think it's important that you do think about what your real strengths are as a company and with your base. Develop a business plan. This seems so simple. It's amazing to me how often we see companies that got together, had some pretty good people, had some pretty good strengths, had the right culture, but they didn't have a roadmap. They didn't know where they were going. My dad always said, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? That kind of thing. I think a well thought out business plan, even if it doesn't last 2 months, and they won't, I think a well thought out business plan is pretty critical. It helps you with these other things. Correct funding. Specifically, the oil and gas business is a huge user of capital. Huge user of capital. That capital wants a return. You want to yield a return if you're going to have a sustainable company. And there's all different ways to get that capital. Many, many, many different ways. A plethora, a whole spectrum of ways. So when you get there, you need to kind of think about how you want to fund it. Debt, mezzanine, 20 different kinds of debt. To the business guys here, I'm speaking to the choir, but equity, lots of different kinds of equity. Public company, lots of ways to make that happen. We've chose private equity. We use private equity at Colt, all three companies. At Laredo, because we had captured such a huge opportunity set, we also did high yield debt, public debt, and we also did a public offering. And that was simply because we had our needs changed for the right kind of equity. Plan for success. We were ready to do the high yield offering. We were ready to do the IPO when we saw that the success was well outrunning our ability to access capital from just private equity sources. This is something you kind of need to think about. If you're successful, how are you going to fund this huge need for capital coming in? Private equity. Private equity gets a lot of attention, I think. It's not hedge funds, although I think lots of times they kind of get lumped together. Most private equity guys are trying to build companies. They're trying to find a management team they can invest in and generate a return that's better than a bond market or a stock portfolio or something. They're not trading hedge fund stocks in and out 10 times a day. They're in there long-term sustainable. They take money from pension funds that know they're going to have to issue paychecks to retirees 10 years from now. They take money from endowments, high net worth investment banks, and then they look for companies like ours to invest in. They really are looking at management team. They look at the business plan. They look at how well you've planned to be successful. They look at all those factors we talked about. They look at your culture and really try and figure out, okay, is this an investment that over 4 or 5, 10 years might yield a pretty good return? There's some advantages There's some disadvantages, and some of the advantages are also disadvantages, depending on where you are. The advantages are you've got access to a huge amount of capital day one. We funded Laredo with $300 million, and 2 years after we funded it, we went back and got another 300 private equity. We had a $300 million commitment at Laredo, and we didn't need it, but it was there. We could have gone and got more. Huge access to capital. Lots of capital that needs a place to go to work. Strategic advice. This is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Most of the time, the private equity guys if they're energy private equity guys, they've invested in 20, 25 energy companies. Warburg Pincus has been doing it for 50 years, over 50 years. They're our provider. So they've seen a lot of mistakes. They've seen a lot of things work well. They're going to have a lot of their capital tied up in the company. So they're going to offer you strategic advice. That can be an advantage. I also have it listed under disadvantages too. You're going to have to take some time. You're going to have to listen to them. If you want to go drive a blue car and they think a red car is the right thing, you're going to have to debate that and make some decisions about what kind of car the company, what direction, and all those kind of things the company really needs. Formal structure. Today, with Sarbanes-Oxley's and some of the other things we have out there, if you're going to be successful, you're going to have a pretty formal structure. We've always had significant board member, outside reputation, independence. We've had audit committees. We've had the formal structure. That's expensive, but it's paid off for us handsomely time after time after time in terms of our banking relations, in terms of how we view the business, and in terms of what we get done. That's also a disadvantage because that's very expensive. You know, it costs a lot of money to have the right accounting systems. It costs a lot of money to have independent boards. It costs a lot of money to have independent auditors audit your books. It costs a lot of money to have third-party reserve reports, talking specifically about oil and gas. So it's a huge advantage, but it does have some disadvantages. Some people view the disadvantages as more important than the advantages. We don't agree with that assessment. Credibility. When you walk into an office and you say, I'm brand spanking new, my name's Randy Foutch, I want you to do business with me, they've never heard of you, you're going to have to pitch your story differently. You walk in and say, I'm Randy Foutch, and I'm bringing Warburg Pincus to the table, and I've got a $600 million check I can write you. That's credibility where I grew up. That's meaningful. It matters a lot. The disadvantage we didn't talk about is there's an investment cycle because ultimately they want their money back. They've got to give their money back to their pension funds and to their money suppliers. So you need to understand their investment cycle. Some private equity is 3 or 4 or 5 years. Some are 10 or 12. But sooner or later you're going to have to give that money back one way or another to the private equity guys. We want to have, when we talk about private equity, we want to have compatibility. And again, talking specifically oil and gas, if your forte is water floods that take 3 or 4 years for fill up and then take another 10 or 12 years to pay out and to generate a 2-to-1 return, and your private equity guys have a 3-year cycle on investment cycle, you're probably not going to have a good relationship. It's not going to work. So there's got to be some compatibility. If you want to drill high-risk wells and they don't understand the risk-reward cycle in oil and gas, probably not going to work. So compatibility is pretty important. Just because they're offering you money doesn't mean you should take it if you want to have a successful company. Private equity is not worth it unless you can get access to significant capital. You know, you don't want to do private equity just to barely get your doors open. You want to make sure that you can survive long-term with access to capital. Long-term investment cycle is important to us. We think we talked about that. They need to understand oil and gas because you're going to make mistakes. You're going to do dry holes. You're going to have things that don't go right. Strategic advice and experience. I actually kind of like the private equity view on strategic advice. They've been down the road a lot. If I do 1 or 2 financings a year, they will often have done 20. They understand pretty well this. So we think that's a really meaningful thing, and we want that requirement. Having said that, I want to temper their advice by having a really strong outside board of directors. I want to have a lot of independent directors who counteract the strategic advice you're getting from your private equity suppliers. Makes for interesting board meetings sometimes, but I do think when you get that much horsepower in the room, intellectual horsepower, you get a better product. Warburg Pincus, they've been doing this a long time. The list of companies that they've invested in. The interesting thing to me is they've taken 120 of their portfolio companies public. So they've built companies, many of whom are still out there as public companies. That's a pretty good testimony, I think, to the private equity model. They're not flipping companies every 3 years. They're building long-term sustainable companies. Pretty meaningful. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly, but we've come a long way in about 6 years. A couple 100 million barrels. We're producing 33 or 34,000 barrels of oil equivalent today. We're concentrated in the Permian Basin. That's about 85% or so of our total company's reserves. Our growth has been spectacular, if I say so myself. You're supposed to applaud when I say that. We're concentrated in we bought this acreage very, very specifically. It worked very well. It's in just east of Midland, Texas. We were the leaders. We were out here well before anybody else, 3 years before anybody else. We do some things that don't work, but we don't talk about those. We just talk about the ones that do work. This has been very, very, very successful. Technically, we're trying to do something that so far the industry hasn't done. We're trying to drill 4 horizontal long-reach wells from the same location in one direction, turn around 180 degrees the other direction, and drill 4 more. Haven't done that yet. We're pretty well ahead on trying to figure that out. Just on the part of the acreage that we've de-risked so far, we think we've got a couple of billion barrels of reserves. That's a big number for us, for a 6-year-old company. I mentioned this. We saw after the private equity investment that we needed additional capital. We're going to need additional capital for years to come. So we went out and we did debt offerings. We have a bank group that I'm very, very happy with. And we did 2 stages of debt. We have a commercial debt, just like you borrow money against your car or your house or whatever. We borrowed money against the reserves. It's currently an $825 million facility. We've drawn not much of that. We also did 2 high-yield public debt, high-yield bonds, in which we pay interest on a payment schedule, but we don't have to pay the principal back for 5 or 6 or 8 years to come. Both of these things allowed us to get our reputation out there, allowed people a chance to invest with us even on a relatively secure basis, allowed us to tell our story publicly, and then we went and did a initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange. This was in December 11, so about 14, 15 months ago. Now we have literally dozens and hundreds of investors that we have to take care of. It goes back to the formal structure. We were prepared for that. It worked out well. We raised $300 million when we did that. And more critical is, at the right time, it allows us to go back to the public market for equity or for additional debt if we need to. So that's kind of the story of us. And then this is where I kind of get to, what's next? What are we going to do next? We know we have hundreds of years of natural gas. It's becoming pretty clear, absolutely clear, that our crude oil supply is sustainable inside our country and Canada. So the question is, what's the next step change going to be? And it probably won't be me. It'll probably be someone in the audience or someone just like you. So that's my talk. I think we have a few minutes for questions and answers. I hope I have answers, and I hope there's questions. So thank you. Do I need a microphone or? Yes, in the back there.
Two quick questions. The first one was on natural gas. There is a kind of a bit of a conflict going on at the moment between industry that would like to export LNG from the U.S. to Asia and Europe, and there's some political resistance, I think, coming from Congress on that. So where do you stand on that, and what do you think are the prospects for exporting LNG to Asia and Europe in the medium term? Second question was there is a critique of the whole horizontal fracturing, the whole shale industry, in that you may get a lot of oil and gas in the first few years, but there could be a very quick peak.
Yeah.
And your decay rates would be significantly more than the 5 or 6% you get for conventional oil and gas. So would you comment on that from the technical standpoint?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll take the second question first. And the second question was, typically the long-reach horizontals have a very high decline, and they do. First-year decline is 70%. I don't know what the average is, and that's a pretty rapid decline. But they do have a very, very long tail. They're hyperbolic and they have a long tail, and after about 4 years, you're probably back in the single-digit decline. So there's tremendous resource, but you're going to have to keep drilling if you're going to continue to produce that resource. It's very economic to do so. So toward the last few years of conventional vertical drilling, we were drilling things in which our annual decline was more like 20 or 25%, maybe more. So I don't view the decline as meaning anything other than we're going to have to continue to have a system to where we can continue to invest. To me, it's economic investment. It's not a big deal. The first question was, what about using natural gas and exporting it? There's a couple of, the reason I put it second was a couple of things there. One of them is I think there's plenty of natural gas to do all the exporting we want. The people, I don't think it's Congress that's opposed to it. I think it's Dow Chemical. I think it's those people that burn natural gas as a feedstock or break it as a feedstock. They want to have the cheapest possible CH4 molecule they can have. No question. Rick and I have been in meetings in which the Dow Chemical guys were presenting and so on and so forth. They have little comment about whether or not it's a security issue for the United States. None of that doesn't matter. They just want to make sure that to the extent we're oversupplied on natural gas, the price stays down. Now, currently we're exporting today about 4 billion cubic feet a day. Have been for some time. I think it's between 3 and 4. There's permits in place to do maybe double that if they can get approval to build. So the exporting of natural gas, I think, is going to happen. We've already seen displacement of coal with natural gas. I drive a Tahoe that's powered by compressed natural gas. It has gasoline as a backup, but I fill it up when I park my car at a place. It takes overnight to fill up. You plug it in. There are 9 commercial stations in Tulsa where I can fill it up in the same amount of time it takes to fill up your car at the convenience store. So I see with the supply we have that, and I pay like $1.30 a gallon right now, the equivalency. So I think we really do have a chance to not only export natural gas, I think we should. It's a commodity just like anything else. We're exporting it now. I think we ought to be driving the nation toward using more compressed natural gas or LNG for transportation. And I think that opens up the opportunity to have the conversation about whether or not we want to be energy secure and energy independent. So that's a long answer. I think we ought to export natural gas. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail of the the supply and production slide, you just kind of hit on a little bit. You said there'd be 8 stages. Is that?
The slide that we showed one location, one surface location, in which we're drilling down 8,000 or 10,000 feet and drilling a horizontal lateral. And we're going to do 4 of those in what's effectively a north direction. And then we're going to turn that rig around and drill 4 of those in the other direction. So we think we're not drilling the horizontal portions out of the same vertical well. We're drilling separate vertical wells. So our view is, for those of you who are engineers, that we'll set that rig up. There's a direction to rig placement with the mud systems and everything. We'll drill the first well, move it 25 feet. It may not be back to back, but that's where we're headed to. Drill another one, move it 25 feet, move another one 25 feet. Turn it around, put the mud system on the other side, drill it, move 25, and share all the common facilities, not have to mobilize the rig, and dramatically reduce cost. So, go ahead.
Thank you.
At the end of your presentation, you suggested what's next. What is the future for oil and gas, and what are the challenges and opportunities? And I think it's significant that the Chinese character for crisis is the same as the Chinese character for opportunity, at least in some dialects. And so if I could chip in, I would say the challenges are going to be carbon emissions and water challenges. Here in Texas, we're facing a potential rolling brownouts this year from lack of production, but we're also very concerned about water constraining issues in terms of energy production. And for example, on this campus, fully half of the water consumed on this campus every year goes to cooling buildings and cooling turbines. So I would be very much interested in hearing what your opinions are with respect to both carbon restrictions in the future and water challenges.
Okay, that's a very fair question. Carbon to me is a long-term question. The more, and the facts are, the more natural gas we use, the better off we are, at least short-term. Certainly, as opposed to crude oil or coal. I think carbon capture and is becoming pretty critical. There's a lot of good work being done on this campus on just that issue. I view natural gas as a step in the right direction, but not where we need to be. So when I talk about it being sustainable, I think it is, but I think we have to address the carbon issue also. Now, I'm kind of a big fan of anything that's sustainable. I like the way that sounds, but when you look at some of the other things that we call sustainable, there's a pretty big footprint, and not just carbon, with some of those other things that we talk about too. The actual manufacture of solar panels, and a long list of things. I don't want to be critical. I think we need to do all those things. Water is, to me, a little bit, it's possibly, I think, going to become at some point the most watched commodity out there. I think it's the real issue, not just for oil and gas, not just for universities using them to cool. I think it's a very, very precious commodity, and we better get on top of it. But let me just make a couple of comments. We, in my company, we're recycling a lot of the water that we use, about 30% today. We're using water in some cases, and we're doing it more and more and more, water that's not potable. You can't drink it. It's not good for livestock. I feel pretty comfortable about taking salty water, using it, and recycling it. Doesn't bother me. There's a lot of interesting statistics running around, and water is going to be very, very important. No, it's just absolutely critical. golf courses and the amount of water I use, when you look at the amount of water that a golf use in this part of the country over the summer, it's huge compared to what we do fracking wells. So it's not just oil and gas fracking, and the water issue is going to be very, very big. As a nation, we better start recognizing that. Yep.
Isn't there a problem with shale fracking?
What was the question? I didn't.
The shale fracking, isn't there a problem concerning the pollution of water?
No.
There isn't.
No.
But apparently, like the shale, when it's fracked, it needs to stay open so that whatever you're trying to mine or get, like oil or gas, can come through the shale. And so whatever that you're using to keep the cracks open apparently contaminates water.
No. You know, I wish I could find out who first started propagating that, because I would insult them every which chance I had. When we frack one of these horizontal wells, we're down 10, 12,000 feet. And if we get a 300-foot diameter frack, we're pretty happy. 400 feet, we're happy. So we're fracking this tube that's 10,000, 12,000 feet down. We're using sand. 99% of what we use is sand or an inert ceramic. All of the potable, drinkable water that we use is within the first 200 or 300 feet, less than 1,000 feet from the surface. There's no water wells drilled much deeper than that, if any. So we're doing all of our stuff way down here. We produce that water that comes back. Not all of it comes back, what it does. In our case, we're trying to recycle more of it. But we have disposal things that are, work well. They've worked for 100 years. There are a lot of issues with water. Frack uses a lot of water. But fracking in terms of contaminating groundwater, freshwater, potable water, or fracking in terms of creating a product that we can't handle properly, just isn't an issue. Even our own Department of Energy says that. So, it's hard for me to believe we've done it a million times and we haven't created a problem somewhere, but just on the odds. But it is a very, very safe, environmental friendly process to do, other than we use a lot of water, arguably not as much as some other things, and it causes a pinpoint carbon emission when you bring all those trucks in for 2 days and have diesel motors running. But what you just outlined is just not an issue. Yeah.
To what extent do you think that recent high degree of cost inflation in the industry is an issue? Do you think it's more of a short-term phenomenon or a longer-term issue?
I'm an operator. I'm not a service company guy. What we've seen, and we don't like signing long-term contracts with service companies. What we've seen is they do a phenomenal job if there's a displacement between services and the need for those services. They fill it and price drops. So 2 years ago, there was a huge run-up in pressure pumping fracking costs. That it's already dropped back down 30, 40%. So they're over any one given year or two period, there's displacements between price and services. But over a decade, those guys fix it pretty quick. Long-term costs always go up over a decade or 15, 20 years. But short-term changes just don't. They impact you quarter to quarter, but they don't impact a project like we have that's a 20-year project. You have a question?
I actually have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll just stick with one. And you showed a graph that displayed the amount of oil you're getting from your fields versus natural gas. So I took away that a lot of the current drilling activity is actually shale oil, meaning that's the predominant product. And so that made me wonder about what distribution infrastructure you have in place to actually capture the volunteer gas, because that's a problem in the Eagle Ford, for example, to actually venting or flaring rather, a lot of that volunteer gas, because there is no distribution infrastructure yet.
Yeah, the big area where we're flaying a lot of gas is the Bakken,
And the
up in
Bakken,
North
sure,
Dakota.
also.
That's the big area, and there's, there was very little oil and gas production there, 10 years ago, and so the infrastructure is behind the production, and lots of things are happening to catch that up. The Eagle Ford is, I can't remember if there's 3 or 4 announced natural gas pipelines coming out of there. The Permian has been, where we are, has been an oil and gas producing area for 80 years. So we have tremendous infrastructure. Where we've had problems is not in a regional sense. Where we've had problems is if you drill 10 wells close together and that first pipe or that first compressor station has a problem. And I think the industry more and more is recognizing that we need to have vapor recovery units. We need to do a pretty good job because of the carbon and other things. So it's an issue. In our production, we're about 75% crude oil, and we really do, on our specific field, go to a lot of trouble to capture those emissions and that gas. We'll flare something when we're testing or if we have an upset, but I'm not going to flare gas any longer than absolutely have to. There's one over here.
Could you talk a little more about the makeup of your current board of directors? And if you were to form a new company, what sorts of people, what sorts of background and experience would you like to have on the board?
That's a really good question in my view. Before all these companies were put together, we sat down and we drew a matrix and said, okay, we're going to have a 7-man board, 8, 10, 9, whatever it is. And what expertise do we want those board members to bring to us? So we have 2 people from within the company. I think it's important for the CEO to be on the board. We have 2 people from Warburg, even though they have a substantive, meaningful position in the company. There are only 2 people on the board. And then we had a matrix, and we put together, we wanted someone that had HR and investor relations and those type things on the board. We found a very unique individual there. We wanted someone who had a big project experience. And this was well before we found this project, but we knew we were out there looking for them. We found that person. We wanted someone who had really good drilling expertise. We found that person. We wanted a couple of people who had in their, not necessarily unique drilling experience, but also had financial capability, capital market knowledge, and we found those people. So we sat down and said, okay, if we're going to be successful, what are those areas that the board's going to have to pay attention to? And then we tried to fill those. Very, very good question, something that takes a lot of thought. We don't always get it right. How are we doing on time?
We have time for maybe one more question.
There's a question way over here.
Hi. I had another question going off the previous one. After you established your board, what were sort of your preliminary steps and strategies in trying to get Warburg to invest in your idea?
Well, Warburg was easy because I'd already made money for other people. The question, I think, is how do you do it the first time? And that's really part of, I think, you need to make sure you know what your culture is going to be, what's important to you as a company. You need to make sure you have a really good business plan. And none of these business plans really survive very long because you're opportunistic to some degree, and you continually get to redo them. I think in our view, we took, at our very first company, Colt Resources, we took a business plan. It didn't last 6 months after we funded, but we articulated what we thought we had in terms of our strengths, back to what I talked about. We spent a little bit of time talking about what we thought how we would mitigate things we didn't do well. And part of that was the board, having representation on the board that fixed it. So what we tried to do was put it in a position to where all of those reasons where private equity could say no, we addressed ahead of time. You know, if they, back to the example I used, where if they were a 4 or 5 year fund and we had 7 or 8 year projects, we had to address that. We had to address mitigation in terms of what expertise we didn't have. We had to address how to get their money back to them at some point. So for us, the first time was interesting, and it was also a little different in that, to be fair, when I first did the Colt, there was really only a half a dozen or so private equity providers that did energy. Today there's 50 or more. And so you need to learn them, you need to go to their conferences, you need to talk to them, you need to figure out what they want. And again, oversimplifying, but if they're used to a blue car, don't tell them you're going to bring them a red car. You know, if they're used to certain attributes, make sure that you're not wasting your time, or tell them why the attributes that you do have they should look at. There's also investment bankers today who will help you do that, which didn't exist 20 years ago. So I think the matchup between your plan and private equity is there's more targets, but it's very, very important to think that through ahead of time. Very good question.